There's an operating system running on 100% of the 500 most powerful computers on Earth. It runs on 90% of public cloud infrastructure. It powers 49% of all global cloud workloads. It runs on 72% of Fortune 1000 companies' container orchestration systems. It is the primary operating system for 78% of the world's developers. It runs 65% of the world's 5G base stations. It powers 58% of the 14 billion connected devices on the Internet of Things. Stock exchanges in every major financial center run on it. The servers behind Google, Amazon, Meta, Netflix, Twitter, and virtually every major technology company you use daily run on it. The International Space Station runs on it. The systems that guided SpaceX's Falcon 9 rockets back to their landing pads run on it. The Android phone in your pocket runs a kernel built on it. And in 2026, for the first time in history, more than 5% of desktop computers in the United States are now running it. The operating system is Linux. And if you think it is a niche tool for programmers and hobbyists, you have not been paying attention. Linux is not taking over. Linux has already taken over most of the computing infrastructure that runs the modern world. The only territory it has not yet conquered in significant numbers is the personal desktop, and even that is changing faster than it ever has before. This is the full story of how Linux went from a Finnish computer science student's hobby project in 1991 to the dominant operating system of the 21st century. What the numbers actually show in 2026, why the momentum is accelerating rather than slowing down, and why the forces that have kept Linux off the mainstream desktop for 30 years are weakening, while the forces driving Linux adoption are growing stronger than ever. Let's start at the beginning, because the origin story of Linux is one of the most improbable success stories in the history of technology. On August 25th, 1991, a 21-year-old Finnish computer science student named Linus Torvalds posted a message to a Usenet forum. The message was casual, almost throwaway in its tone. He said he was making a free operating system, just a hobby, nothing big and professional like GNU, and asked what features most people wanted. What followed over the next 3 decades was a global collaboration unlike anything the software world had seen before. Thousands of developers from every country on Earth, working for companies that were often fierce competitors in the marketplace, contributed code to a single shared kernel that nobody owned and everybody could use. The Linux kernel grew from Torvalds' hobby project into a 34 million line codebase, maintained by over 11,000 contributors in its most recent release cycle. Those contributors represent 1,780 organizations, companies including Google, Intel, IBM, Red Hat, Samsung, Huawei, Microsoft, and hundreds of others who pay their engineers to write code for an operating system they give away for free, because the infrastructure it enables is worth more to them than any licensing fee could be. The global Linux operating system market was valued at $21.97 billion in 2024. By 2026, that figure has risen to approximately $31.84 billion. By 2032, independent market analysts project it will reach $99.69 billion, a compound annual growth rate of 20.9%. These are not the numbers of a niche operating system. These are the numbers of a dominant technology platform in full-scale global expansion. And when you break down where that growth is coming from, the picture becomes even clearer. The server market is where Linux's dominance is most absolute and most consequential. Linux commands 44.8% of the global server operating system market as of 2024, with projections placing Linux-based systems at 51.3% of server OS share by 2026, meaning Linux will cross the absolute majority of all server deployments on the planet within the current year. Red Hat. Enterprise Linux leads the enterprise server segment with 43.1% market share in managed environments. Ubuntu holds 33.9% of general Linux deployments. SUSE holds 11.2%, primarily in manufacturing and retail. Debian maintains 16% in stability-focused deployments. The entire enterprise server ecosystem has been restructured around Linux. SAP, the German enterprise software giant whose products run the financial and operational backbone of the majority of the world's largest corporations, reports that 78.5% of its clients deploy their SAP applications on Linux systems. The world's largest businesses, running the most critical and expensive enterprise software ever written, have chosen Linux as their foundation. The cloud tells the same story at an even larger scale. Linux powers 90% of all public cloud workloads globally. Google Cloud runs Linux on 91.6% of its virtual machines. Amazon Web Services runs Linux on 83.5% of its instances. Microsoft Azure, the cloud platform of the company that invented Windows, runs Linux on 61.8% of its virtual machines. Read that again. Microsoft, the company that built the world's dominant desktop operating system and spent decades treating Linux as a competitive threat, now runs Linux on the majority of its cloud infrastructure. Azure was historically the most Windows-heavy of the major cloud providers, and even there, Linux runs on more than 6 out of every 10 virtual machines. This is not a trend that is going to reverse. Cloud spending grew 25% year over year in 2025, reaching $99 billion in a single quarter. The infrastructure absorbing that spending is overwhelmingly Linux infrastructure. Every dollar of cloud growth is a dollar that flows disproportionately through Linux systems. Containerization has made Linux's cloud dominance even more entrenched and difficult to displace. Docker, the containerization platform that transformed how software is developed, shipped, and deployed, runs on Linux and runs Linux containers as its primary workload. Docker maintains an 87.67% market share in containerization, with over 108,000 companies using it globally in 2025. The Docker container market was valued at $6.12 billion in 2025 and is projected to reach $16.32 billion by 2030, a 21.7% compound annual growth rate. Kubernetes, the container orchestration system originally developed by Google, runs on Linux and manages Linux containers. Kubernetes holds 92% market share in container orchestration, with 5.6 million developers globally using the platform. 72.7% of Fortune 1000 companies use Kubernetes to orchestrate their containerized workloads. Every one of those deployments runs on Linux. Containerization did not just grow on Linux. It made Linux the default foundation for modern application deployment in a way that is structurally very difficult to replace. You cannot run Kubernetes meaningfully on Windows or macOS. You can run it on Linux. So every organization that adopted containers adopted Linux in the process, often without making a deliberate decision to do so. Supercomputing represents the most extreme expression of Linux's dominance. Since November 2017, every single one of the 500 most powerful supercomputers on Earth has run Linux. 100%, no exceptions. El Capitan at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, the most powerful computer ever built, achieving 1.742 exaflops of computational performance, runs Linux. The system that will model nuclear weapons behavior, climate change, and biological simulations at scales no previous computer could reach runs Linux. Every national laboratory, every university HPC cluster, every private research computing environment at the frontier of what is computationally possible runs Linux. The reason is straightforward and technical. Linux's open source kernel can be customized, optimized, and modified at every level of the software stack in ways that proprietary operating systems cannot. When you are squeezing every last instruction out of a system with hundreds of thousands of CPU cores and specialized interconnects, you need to be able to modify the kernel itself. Linux lets you do that. Windows does not. The financial sector runs on Linux in ways that most retail banking customers never see or think about. Stock exchanges in every major financial center globally show over 75% Linux usage in 2025. High-frequency trading platforms, the algorithmic systems that execute millions of trades per second on the world's financial markets, run on Linux because of its latency advantages and the ability to modify the kernel's scheduling behavior to reduce the time between a market event and a trade execution to microseconds. When a trading firm buys a Linux server and tunes the kernel's real-time scheduling parameters, it can achieve response latencies that are physically impossible on Windows. In a world where being 10 microseconds faster than a competitor is worth hundreds of millions of dollars per year, the operating system choice is not ideological. It is economical. Linux wins on economics, and the financial sector runs on Linux as a result. Financial services, Linux infrastructure, grew 21.5% year over year in 2025. Linux system administrators in the financial sector command the highest median salaries in the industry, $143,456 annually, reflecting how critical Linux expertise is to the operation of global finance. Government infrastructure is another area where Linux adoption has crossed the majority threshold. Government data centers worldwide reported 64.9% Linux deployment in 2025, up from lower levels in previous years as public sector IT modernization programs accelerated. The shift is driven by 3 forces simultaneously: cost, control, and compliance. Linux eliminates the per-seat licensing costs that Windows imposes on government deployments, costs that add up to hundreds of millions of dollars per year across large federal agencies. It gives governments control over their infrastructure in a way that running proprietary software from a private American corporation does not, a concern that is particularly acute for non-US governments that worry about the intelligence and surveillance implications of building their digital infrastructure on software they cannot inspect. And it enables compliance with data sovereignty and security regulations that require the ability to audit the software running on government systems at the source code level. The European Union has been actively discussing an EU Linux initiative, and open source operating system developed for and by European public administrations that would reduce dependence on American technology platforms. Switzerland has already committed $231 million to build a national cloud service and passed legislation requiring government-developed software to be released as open source. These are not marginal developments. They represent the beginning of a structural shift in how governments around the world think about their relationship with proprietary software vendors. The developer community is perhaps the most strategically important front in Linux's ongoing expansion, because developers build the software that everyone else uses, and the development environment they work in shapes what they build and where they build it. The Stack Overflow Developer Survey 2025, capturing responses from over 49,000 developers across 177 countries, found that 78.5% of developers globally use Linux as a primary or secondary operating system. Cloud-native developers show even stronger preference at 90.1% Linux adoption. 68.2% of DevOps teams use Linux as their primary platform for CI/CD pipelines and infrastructure management. 53.4% of all software development environments worldwide use Linux as the primary OS. When developers work on Linux all day, they test on Linux, deploy to Linux, and build software that runs best on Linux. The developer preference for Linux creates a feedback loop that continuously reinforces Linux's dominance in production. Environments. Applications are written on Linux, tested on Linux, containerized on Linux, and deployed to Linux cloud infrastructure. Windows and macOS are increasingly becoming platforms for consuming software rather than building it. The gaming front, long considered one of the last significant holdouts for Windows on the desktop, has shifted meaningfully in Linux's favor over the past 3 years. This shift has a single primary driver, Valve. The company behind Steam, the world's largest PC gaming distribution platform, made a strategic decision several years ago that Linux gaming compatibility was essential to the long-term future of PC gaming without Microsoft's control. Valve developed Proton, a compatibility layer built on Wine and DXVK that allows Windows games to run on Linux without modification, and invested heavily in its development over multiple years. The results have been transformative. The vast majority of Steam's library of games now runs on Linux through Proton, including many titles that were never officially supported on Linux. In October 2025, Linux gaming market share on Steam reached 3.05%, the highest level since Steam for Linux launched, and a 52% increase from October 2024's 2%. Valve's Steam Deck handheld gaming console runs SteamOS, which is based on Arch Linux. Every Steam Deck unit sold is a Linux machine in the hands of a mainstream consumer, a consumer who may not know or care that they are running Linux, but who is running it nonetheless. SteamOS accounts for approximately 30% of all Linux gaming systems. The desktop Linux story in 2026 is simultaneously the most modest and the most interesting part of the overall picture. Linux desktop market share reached 4.7% globally in 2025, a 70% increase from 2.76% in July 2022. In the United States, Linux crossed the 5% threshold for the first time in June 2025, reaching 5.03%. India leads all major economies with 16.21% Linux desktop adoption. Current growth trajectories suggest Linux could reach 6% global desktop market share by late 2026 if current trends continue. These numbers are still modest compared to Windows' 73% global desktop share, but the trajectory matters as much as the absolute position. Several converging forces are driving the desktop acceleration. The first is Windows 10's end of support, which occurred in October 2025. With Windows 10 official support ended, Microsoft is pushing users to upgrade to Windows 11, an upgrade that requires TPM 2.0 hardware, meaning hundreds of millions of computers that run Windows 10 perfectly well today are officially unsupported for Windows 11 without hardware upgrades. Users facing a choice between buying a new computer, paying for extended Windows 10 security updates, or switching to Linux, are increasingly discovering that modern Linux distributions, Ubuntu, Fedora, Linux Mint, Pop! OS, and others, run beautifully on the hardware that Microsoft says cannot support Windows 11. Linux becomes the path to keeping functional hardware in use rather than sending it to a landfill. The environmental and economic logic of this choice is compelling, and it is driving real adoption. The second force is privacy. The Windows 11 installation process, the forced Microsoft account requirement, the automatic BitLocker key upload to Microsoft servers, the telemetry collection tied to a cloud identity, all of these have pushed privacy-conscious users toward Linux in increasing numbers. Linux distributions by default do not phone home to a corporation. They do not require an account to use your own computer. They do not upload your encryption keys to cloud servers you do not control. In an era of growing awareness about data collection and surveillance capitalism, this distinction matters to a growing segment of the computing population. The third force is artificial intelligence and machine learning. Machine learning workloads on Linux reached 87.8% in 2025. Every major AI framework, TensorFlow, PyTorch, JAX, and the rest, is developed on Linux, optimized for Linux, and deployed on Linux. The AI revolution that is reshaping every industry in the world is being built entirely on Linux infrastructure. The GPU clusters training the world's most powerful AI models run Linux. The inference servers running the AI products billions of people use every day run Linux. Cybersecurity professionals recorded 79.1% Linux adoption in 2025 because the tools, the terminal, and the kernel visibility that security work requires are native to Linux in ways they are not on Windows. The Linux kernel that Linus Torvalds started in 1991 as a hobby project now contains 34 million lines of code. It is contributed to by engineers from 500 to 180 organizations. It runs on hardware from microcontrollers smaller than a thumbnail to supercomputers that fill entire buildings. It powers the smartphones of 3 billion Android users, the cloud infrastructure of the internet economy, the financial systems of global capital markets, the scientific computing that advances human knowledge, and the routers and switches that carry internet traffic across the planet. The global Linux operating system market is on track to nearly hit $100 billion by 2032, growing at nearly 21% per year. The question has never really been whether Linux is winning. In most of the places that matter most, servers, cloud, supercomputing, embedded systems, mobile, financial infrastructure, government, scientific computing, developer tooling, AI, and machine learning, Linux has already won. The question is how long it takes for the desktop to catch up to the rest of the story. And in 2026, with Windows 10 support ended, Windows 11's hardware requirements pushing millions of users off the Microsoft upgrade path, and Linux desktop distributions more polished and capable than they have ever been, the answer to that question is changing. Nobody is going to stop this. Not Microsoft, not Apple, not any proprietary software vendor. The economics of open source development, the scale of global contributions, the network effects of an operating system that runs on 100% of supercomputers and 90% of cloud infrastructure, the 34 million lines of collaboratively written code, none of that is reversible. Linux is not the future of computing. Linux is the present of computing. Most people just have not noticed yet.